I thought I had loved once and lost that love to death, and believed, with the certainty of grief, that such a thing could never come to me again. If you have ever loved and lost, and wonder whether the heart can hold more than one truth at once, then stay. This is a story you may understand. My name is Eleanor Ashford, though I was born Eleanor Pritchard, and I tell you this now not because names matter greatly in the eyes of God, but because they mattered a great deal in the eyes of men in those days, and in my own eyes too, for a very long time. I was 32 years old in the spring of 1892 when I came to Thornfield House in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and I had been a widow for 4 years. 4 years is not so very long, perhaps, when measured against a lifetime, but it is long enough to grow accustomed to solitude, long enough to believe that the shape of your days will never alter, and long enough to forget that the heart, once broken, may still be capable of dangerous and inconvenient things. I had been a schoolteacher for 3 of those 4 years, employed first in a dame school in Halifax, and later in a small parish school near Haworth, where the wind came down off the moors with a voice like morning, and the children arrived each morning with chilblained hands and empty stomachs. I did what I could. I was not a remarkable teacher, I think, but I was steady, and I was kind, and I asked nothing for myself that I did not also ask of them: attention, discipline, and a quiet respect for the idea that learning might be a lantern in the dark. My late husband, Thomas, had been an overlooker in a woolen mill. We had married when I was 23 and he 26, and for 5 years we had lived modestly but contentedly in 2 rented rooms above a draper's shop in Bradford. He was a good man, patient, earnest, possessed of a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly, like a trout breaking the surface of a still pond. He had taught me to read Latin in the evenings by candlelight, though he had learned it himself only from a traveling tutor years before, and we had shared a love of poetry that neither of us dared speak of to our neighbors, for fear of seeming above ourselves. We had been happy. I say this plainly, without decoration, because it is true, and because what came later cannot be understood unless you know that I had already been loved well, and had loved well in return. Thomas died of pneumonia in the winter of 1888, after working a double shift in the mill during a cold snap that froze the canal solid. He came home fevered and shaking, and within a week he was gone. I did not weep at his funeral. I stood beside the grave in my black bombazine and felt as though I had been carved from stone, and when the vicar spoke of resurrection and eternal life, I heard the words as though from a great distance, as one hears the sound of church bells across a valley. I did not disbelieve them. I simply could not imagine that they had anything to do with me. Afterward, I sold what little we had owned and took the position in Halifax. I told myself that teaching would give my life purpose, and it did, in a manner of speaking. But purpose is not the same as joy, and I think I knew even then that I was not so much living as I was waiting. Waiting, perhaps, to feel something again, or waiting to stop feeling altogether. I am not sure which. It was my former headmistress, Mrs. Hartley, who arranged for me to come to Thornfield House. The family there, the Ashtons, were of the old gentry, possessed of land and income sufficient to insulate them from the harshness of industrial life, though not so grand as to be entirely removed from it. The master of the house, Mr. Charles Ashton, was a widower himself, his wife having died in childbirth some years earlier, and he had a young daughter, Lily, who was 8 years old and in need of instruction. There had been a governess before me, I learned, but she had left abruptly, and Mr. Ashton had written to Mrs. Hartley requesting someone older, steadier, and less inclined toward romantic fancies. I suspect Mrs. Hartley thought of me at once. I arrived on a wet April morning, traveling by rail from Halifax and then by hired trap along narrow lanes bordered by dry stone walls. The countryside was green and raw with spring, the hawthorn just beginning to bud, and the air smelled of wet earth and sheep. Thornfield House itself was not a grand estate. It was a manor house of modest proportions, built of gray stone and situated on a rise overlooking a valley dotted with farms and a narrow river that glinted silver in the distance. There was a walled garden to one side, overgrown with ivy, and a line of beeches along the drive that swayed in the wind like women in mourning. I was met at the door by the housekeeper, Mrs. Darrow, a stout, unsmiling woman who looked me over with the assessing eye of one who has seen many employees come and go. She showed me to my room, a small, plain chamber on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the garden, and informed me that I would meet Miss Lily at tea and Mr. Ashton at supper. She did not ask me any questions about myself, and I was grateful for that. Lily was a solemn child, pale and delicate, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. She had been educated haphazardly, I discovered, and her knowledge was uneven. She could recite passages of Shakespeare, but could not multiply beyond her fives, and her handwriting was atrocious. But she was not unintelligent, and she was eager in her cautious way to please. We began our lessons in the schoolroom on the third floor, a bright, airy space with tall windows and shelves of dusty books, and within a week we had established a routine: mornings for arithmetic and grammar, afternoons for history and literature, and an hour before supper for drawing or music, at which she showed a modest talent. I did not meet Mr. Ashton for nearly a fortnight. He was often away, Mrs. Darrow explained, attending to business in Leeds or York, and when he was at home, he kept to his study or the estate office. I caught glimpses of him now and then, a tall figure crossing the hall or standing at the window of the library with his back to the room. But we did not speak, and I did not seek an introduction. I had no reason to. I was there for Lily, not for her father, and I had long since learned that it was better to remain unnoticed. And then, one afternoon in early May, he came to the schoolroom. I heard his step on the stairs, a firm, even tread, and looked up from the copybook I was correcting to see him standing in the doorway. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and a face that was handsome in a grave, unsmiling way. He was dressed simply, in a tweed jacket and waistcoat, and he held a book in one hand. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, inclining his head. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Forgive the intrusion. I wanted to see how Lily was progressing." I rose and curtsied, aware of Lily watching us both with wide eyes. "She is doing very well, sir. She has a quick mind and a willingness to learn." He glanced at his daughter, and something softened in his expression. A flicker of warmth, quickly hidden. "That is good to hear. I confess I have been neglectful of her education. Her previous governess was not well suited to the task. She will catch up, sir. She is already improving." He nodded, and for a moment he seemed about to leave. Then he looked at me more closely, and I felt the weight of his attention in a way that was not unpleasant, but was oddly unsettling. "You have been a teacher for some time," Mrs. Darrow tells me. 3 years, sir. And before that?" I hesitated. It was not a question I was often asked, and I was not sure how much to say. "I was married, sir. My husband was an overlooker in Bradford." "I see." He paused, and there was something in his gaze, not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though he understood what I had not said. "You have my condolences." "Thank you, sir." He inclined his head again and turned to go, but at the door he stopped and looked back. "If you have need of anything, books, materials, anything at all for Lily's instruction, you have only to ask." "I will, sir. Thank you." And then he was gone, and I was left standing in the schoolroom with the sun slanting through the windows and Lily's curious eyes upon me. "Papa does not often come upstairs," she said softly. I sat down again and took up the copybook, though my hands were not quite steady. Perhaps he will come more often now. I did not know then how true that would prove to be. Over the following weeks, Mr. Ashton did indeed come more often to the schoolroom. At first, it was only in passing, a brief visit to observe Lily's progress, or to deliver a new book he thought might interest her. But gradually, his visits grew longer. He would linger by the window, listening as I read aloud from the Pilgrim's Progress or Gulliver's Travels, or he would sit at the table and watch as Lily worked through a problem in arithmetic, offering a word of encouragement when she succeeded. He spoke little, but his presence was not oppressive. It was, rather, quietly companionable, and I found that I did not mind it. He was, I came to understand, a man who carried his grief as I carried mine, privately, without complaint, but with a weight that showed in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his mouth. He had loved his wife deeply, that much was clear, and her death had left him adrift. He had buried himself in the management of the estate. Mrs. Darrow told me one afternoon as we sat together in the kitchen shelling peas, and he had little patience for society or for the matchmaking efforts of the local gentry. "He's a good man," she said, her voice gruff with affection. "But he's lonely, poor soul, and he doesn't know it." I said nothing, but I thought of Thomas and of the loneliness that had settled over me like a fog after his death, and I wondered if Mr. Ashton felt the same. It was in June, on a warm evening after supper, that he first asked me to walk with him in the garden. I had been sitting in the library, reading by lamplight, when he appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "would you care to take the air? The evening is fine." I hesitated, aware that such an invitation was irregular and that there was no good reason for me to accept it. But I was also aware that I had spent the entire day indoors, and that the thought of the garden, with its scent of roses and its cool shadows, was suddenly very appealing. "Thank you, sir. I would." We walked in silence at first, following the gravel path that wound through the walled garden and out into the orchard beyond. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. I was acutely conscious of his presence beside me, of the way he matched his pace to mine, and of the faint scent of tobacco and wool that clung to his coat. I felt, for the first time in years, a stirring of something I could not name, something that was not quite unease, but was very close to it. "You care for Lily very much," he said at last, breaking the silence. "She is easy to care for, sir." "That is kind of you to say. I fear I have not been present as I ought to have been. Her mother's death—" He paused, and I heard the catch in his voice. I did not know how to speak to her after, how to be a father to her. I still do not, in truth. I glanced at him and saw the vulnerability in his face, the same vulnerability I had seen in the mirror after Thomas died, when I could not recognize the woman staring back at me. "Grief is not something we overcome, sir," I said quietly. "It is something we learn to carry. And Lily sees your love for her, even if you do not always find the words." He stopped walking and turned to face me. "You speak as one who knows." "I do." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes a question he did not ask aloud. Then he nodded and resumed walking, and we continued in silence until we reached the far end of the orchard, where a stone bench sat beneath an old apple tree. He gestured to it, and I sat, and he sat beside me, and for a time we simply watched the light fade from the sky. "I envy you your faith," he said at last. I looked at him in surprise. "My faith, sir?" "In teaching. In the belief that knowledge and discipline can shape a life. I have no such faith. I manage the estate because it is what I was raised to do, but I take no pleasure in it. It is only duty." I considered his words and felt a pang of recognition. "Duty is not nothing, sir. It is what sustains us when joy is absent." "Perhaps." He was silent for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Do you ever feel, Mrs. Ashford, that you are merely going through the motions of life? That you are present, but not truly living?" I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap, and thought of the 4 years since Thomas's death, of the long gray days and the nights when I had lain awake, willing myself to feel something other than absence. "Yes," I said, "I feel that very often." He did not reply, and when I finally looked up, I found him watching me with an expression I could not read. It was not pity, and it was not curiosity. It was something else, something that made my heart beat faster, and that filled me with a sudden, inexplicable fear. "We should go in," I said, rising quickly. "It is growing late." He stood as well, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. But he only nodded and offered me his arm, and we walked back to the house in silence. After that evening, I began to avoid him. It was not a conscious decision at first. I simply arranged my days so that I was less likely to encounter him, taking Lily for walks in the afternoon when I knew he would be in the estate office, or retiring to my room in the evenings rather than sitting in the library. I told myself that it was for the best, that I had no business spending time alone with him, that such familiarity was inappropriate and could only lead to complications. But the truth, which I did not wish to acknowledge, was that I was afraid. I was afraid of the way his presence made me feel, of the strange, half-formed longing that rose in me when he spoke, and the way I found myself thinking of him at odd moments, when I should have been thinking of my lessons or my prayers. I was afraid, too, of the guilt that came with such thoughts, the sense that I was betraying Thomas's memory by allowing another man to occupy any part of my mind or heart. Thomas had been my husband, my companion, my love. To feel anything for another man seemed a violation of what we had shared, a denial of the vow I had made to honor him all the days of my life. And yet, no matter how I tried to avoid Mr. Ashton, he seemed always to find me. He came to the schoolroom more frequently, bringing books and asking questions about Lily's progress. He invited me to walk with him again and again, and though I made excuses the first few times, I eventually relented, unable to refuse without seeming rude. He spoke to me as an equal, seeking my opinions on matters of education and philosophy, and even, on occasion, on the management of the estate, and I found myself responding with an honesty I had not shown to anyone since Thomas. He listened with an attention that was both flattering and disconcerting, and I began to realize, with a growing sense of alarm, that he valued my company in a way that went beyond mere courtesy. It was in July, during the hay harvest, that I first understood the danger of my situation. We had been walking along the river, following a footpath that wound through the meadows below the house. Lily had run ahead, chasing butterflies, and Mr. Ashton and I followed at a slower pace. The day was hot, the air thick with the scent of cut grass, and I could hear the distant voices of the farmhands calling to one another as they worked. We had been speaking of books, of Wordsworth, I think, and his love of the natural world, and I had just finished reciting a passage from Tintern Abbey when he stopped and turned to me. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "may I ask you something?" I felt a flicker of unease. "Of course, sir." He hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "Do you ever think of remarrying?" The question struck me like a blow. I stared at him, unable to speak, and felt the blood rise to my face. "Sir, Forgive me," he said quickly. "That was impertinent. I had no right to ask." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "No, you did not." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding, and did not stop until I reached Lily, who was standing by the water's edge with a handful of wildflowers. I took her hand and led her back toward the house, not daring to look behind me to see if he followed. That evening, I wrote a letter to Mrs. Hartley, asking if she might help me secure another position. I told her that I was grateful for the opportunity at Thornfield, but that I felt it was time to move on. I did not give a reason, and I did not post the letter. I placed it in my writing desk and left it there, a silent reminder of what I knew I ought to do, even as I found myself unable to do it. August came, and with it a spell of heat that left the moors brown and parched. Lily and I took our lessons in the garden, sitting in the shade of the beeches, and in the evenings I sat by the open window of my room, too restless to sleep. Mr. Ashton did not walk with me again, and when we met at meals or in the corridors of the house, he was unfailingly polite and distant. I told myself that I was relieved, but the truth was that I missed him, missed his voice, his presence, the way he made me feel as though I mattered, as though I were more than simply a widow in black bombazine, teaching another woman's child. It was during that month that I began to receive letters. The first arrived on a Monday morning, brought to me by one of the maids along with my breakfast tray. It was a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax, and when I opened it, I found a few lines written in a firm, elegant hand. "Mrs. Ashford, forgive my presumption in writing to you, but I find that I cannot speak to you as I wish, and so I must resort to this less satisfactory method. I have been thinking a great deal about our conversation by the river, and I fear that I offended you. That was never my intention. You have brought light into this house and into Lily's life, and I would not lose your good opinion for the world. If I have caused you distress, I beg you to tell me how I may make amends. Yours, C. Ashton." I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking, and then I folded it and placed it in my desk beside the unsent letter to Mrs. Hartley. I did not reply, but the letters continued. They came every few days, always brief, always carefully worded, and always left for me in places where I would find them, on the schoolroom table, tucked into a book I was reading, once even placed on the bench in the garden where we had sat together that first evening. He did not speak of love or even of affection. He spoke instead of books we had discussed, of observations he had made while walking the estate, of small, inconsequential things that nevertheless revealed the workings of his mind. He asked my opinion on matters large and small, on whether children should be taught Latin, on the merits of crop rotation, on whether the new railway line would bring progress or ruin to the valley. He wrote as though we were friends, as though there were nothing strange or improper in such a correspondence, and I found that I could not bring myself to ask him to stop. I began, against my better judgment, to reply. My responses were brief and carefully impersonal, but they were responses nonetheless, and I left them in the library where I knew he would find them. I told myself that it was harmless, that we were simply two lonely people finding solace in conversation, and that there was nothing in our letters that could not have been spoken aloud. But I knew, even as I wrote, that I was deceiving myself. The letters were not harmless. They were intimate in a way that speech could never be, and they created between us a bond that was both fragile and dangerous. By September, I no longer questioned whether I cared for him. I knew that I did. I knew it in the way my heart lifted when I saw his handwriting, in the way I found myself thinking of things to tell him, in the way I looked for him in the evenings and felt a pang of disappointment when he was not there. But I also knew that such feelings were impossible, that they could lead nowhere, and that I owed it to Thomas and to myself to resist them. And yet, I could not seem to let him go. It was in October, on the eve of Lily's 9th birthday, that everything changed. Mr. Ashton had planned a small celebration, a tea in the drawing room with a few neighbors and their children, and a cake baked by the cook. I had helped Lily choose a new dress for the occasion, a pale blue muslin that made her look older than her years, and I had spent the morning arranging flowers in the drawing room and ensuring that everything was in order. I was not to attend the party itself, of course. Such gatherings were not for governesses, but I stood at the door of the schoolroom and watched as Lily descended the stairs, her face alight with excitement, and I felt a bittersweet ache at the thought of how much she had grown. The party lasted for 2 hours, and when it was over, Mr. Ashton came to find me. I was in the schoolroom, tidying away the day's lessons, when he appeared in the doorway. He looked tired, and there was a tightness around his mouth that I had not seen before. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "may I speak with you?" I set down the books I was holding and nodded. "Of course, sir." He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. Then he said, very quietly, "I have been offered a position in London, a seat on the board of a manufacturing concern. It would require me to move, to take a house in the city, and to spend most of my time there." I felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath me. "I see. Lily would come with me, of course, and I would need someone to continue her education, someone she trusts." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I am asking you to come with us." I stared at him, unable to speak. The room was very quiet, and I could hear the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the faint sound of voices from downstairs. "Why?" I said at last. "Because I cannot imagine being without you." The words hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable, and I felt something inside me break open, something that I had been holding closed for 4 long years. I wanted to say yes. I wanted it with a fierceness that frightened me, a longing that was as much physical as it was emotional. But I also knew that I could not. "Mr. Ashton," I said, and my voice was shaking, "I cannot." He took a step toward me, and I saw the pain in his face. "Why not?" "Because it would be wrong. Because I am a widow, and you are—" I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I am what? A man who has spent the last 4 months falling in love with you?" I closed my eyes and felt tears slip down my cheeks. "You should not say such things." "Why not? Because it is improper? Because I am your employer?" His voice was fierce now, almost angry. "I do not care about propriety, Eleanor. I care about you. I care about the way you have brought life back into this house and into my heart. I care about the conversations we have shared and the letters we have written and the way I feel when I am with you. I care about all of it, and I will not apologize for it." I opened my eyes and looked at him, and saw in his face a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "I loved my husband," I said, my voice breaking. "I loved him deeply. And when he died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I could never feel that way again. And I did not want to. To love again feels like a betrayal. Of him, of the vows I made, of everything we shared. I cannot do that to his memory." "And what of your own life?" he said gently. "What of your own heart? Do you owe nothing to yourself?" "I owe myself nothing," I said. "I owe him everything." He was silent for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "I understand, and I will not ask again. But know this, Eleanor, I will wait. Whether you come to London or not, whether you ever feel able to love me or not, I will wait, because you are worth waiting for." And then he turned and left the room, and I was alone. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, and felt as though I were being torn in two. On one side was Thomas, gentle, steady Thomas, who had loved me and whom I had loved, and whose death had left a void that I had thought could never be filled. On the other side was Charles Ashton, who had somehow, without my permission or intent, become essential to me, and whose absence I could not imagine bearing. I thought of the letters we had written, and the walks we had taken, and the quiet moments in the library when we had sat together reading by lamplight. I thought of the way he looked at me, and the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, and the way I felt when I was with him, alive and seen and valued. I thought, too, of Lily, and of how much I would miss her if I stayed behind. But most of all, I thought of Thomas. I thought of the life we had built together, and the promises we had made, and the grief that had consumed me when he died. I thought of how I had believed, with absolute certainty, that loving again would diminish what we had shared, that it would be a kind of infidelity, a betrayal of the man who had given me his whole heart. And yet, as I lay there in the darkness, I began to wonder if that was true. Thomas had loved me, yes, but he had also wanted me to be happy. He had wanted me to live fully, to find joy, to embrace the world with both hands. He had told me as much in the days before he died, when he had lain in our bed, with his breath rattling in his chest and his hand clasped in mine. "Promise me," he had said, his voice barely a whisper, "that you will not grieve forever. Promise me that you will find a way to be happy again." I had promised, though I had not believed it possible, and now, 4 years later, I was being offered a chance to keep that promise, and I was refusing it, not out of loyalty to Thomas, but out of fear. Fear of loving again, fear of losing again, fear of allowing myself to be vulnerable, to open my heart to the possibility of joy, and with it, the possibility of pain. But was that what Thomas would have wanted? Would he have wanted me to spend the rest of my life in mourning, shutting myself off from love and connection and all the things that make life worth living? Or would he have wanted me to take the risk, to embrace the chance I had been given, to honor his memory not by refusing to love, but by loving as fully and as bravely as he had loved me? I did not know. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I realized that I had to find out. The next morning, I went to Mr. Ashton's study. He was sitting at his desk, going over a stack of papers, and he looked up in surprise when I knocked. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, rising to his feet, "is something wrong?" "No," I said, and my voice was steady. "I have come to give you my answer." He went very still. "And what is your answer?" I took a breath and felt the fear and the longing and the grief all tangled together in my chest. I will come with you to London, but I must ask you something first. Anything. If I come, it will not be as your governess alone. I will come as... I stopped, struggling to find the words. I will come as someone who cares for you, deeply. But I need you to understand that I am still learning how to do this, how to love again without feeling as though I am betraying the man I loved before. I need you to be patient with me. Can you do that? He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my hands in his. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, I will be as patient as you need me to be. I will wait as long as it takes, and I will never, ever ask you to forget him. I would not want to. He was part of your life, and he made you who you are, and I am grateful to him for that. I looked up at him and saw in his eyes a tenderness that took my breath away. You are a good man, Charles. I am a man in love, he said simply. And I want nothing more than to spend my life proving to you that love does not end. It only grows. And then, very gently, he drew me into his arms, and I let him. And for the first time since Thomas's death, I allowed myself to believe that I might, after all, be worthy of happiness. We moved to London in November. The house Charles had taken was in Bloomsbury, a tall, narrow building with a small garden at the back and a view of the square. Lily was delighted by the city, by the noise and the crowds and the endless variety of shops and theaters and museums, and she adapted to her new life with the resilience of the young. I adapted more slowly. I missed the quiet of the countryside, the wide skies and the wind on the moors, and I found the city overwhelming at first. But Charles was patient, as he had promised to be, and he helped me find my footing. He did not press me for declarations of love, or for any commitment beyond what I was ready to give. He simply included me in his life, introducing me to his friends and colleagues not as Lily's governess, but as a valued companion, and he sought my opinion on matters of business and household management as though it were natural to do so. He wrote to me still, even though we lived under the same roof, leaving little notes on my breakfast tray or tucked into the books I was reading, and I wrote back, and gradually the distance between us began to close. But it was not until the spring that I finally allowed myself to speak the words I had been holding back. We had taken Lily to the British Museum one Saturday afternoon, and afterward we had walked through Russell Square, enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. Lily had run ahead to feed the ducks, and Charles and I had lingered by the fountain, watching her. She is happy here, I said. She is happy because you are here, he said. As am I. I looked at him, at the way the sunlight caught in his hair, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. Charles, I said, I need to tell you something. He turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. What is it? I love you, I said, and the words came out easily, without hesitation or doubt. I have loved you for months, perhaps longer, but I was afraid to say it. I thought that loving you would mean forgetting Thomas or dishonoring his memory. But I understand now that it does not. Loving you does not diminish what I felt for him. It is simply different, a different kind of love for a different season of my life, and I want to embrace it if you will let me. He did not answer with words. He simply took my face in his hands and kissed me, gently and reverently, as though I were something precious and fragile. And when he finally drew back, there were tears in his eyes. I will let you, he said. God, Eleanor, I will let you. We were married in June in a small ceremony at a church near the house. Lily stood beside me as I spoke my vows, and afterward we walked through the streets of Bloomsbury together, the three of us, and I felt a completeness that I had not thought possible. It was not the same as it had been with Thomas. How could it be? Thomas had been my first love, my companion in youth, the man who had taught me what it meant to be cherished. Charles was something else, a second chance, a new beginning, a love born not of innocence, but of experience and loss, and the hard-won knowledge that life is short and precious and not to be wasted. But it was love, nonetheless, deep and abiding and real. And as I walked through those sunlit streets with Charles's hand in mine and Lily's laughter ringing in my ears, I thought of Thomas, and I whispered a silent thank you to him for releasing me, for loving me enough to want me to be happy, and for teaching me that the heart is capable of holding more than one truth at once. I had loved him. I would always love him. But I had also learned that love does not end with loss. It transforms, it grows, it makes room for new joys and new sorrows, and all the messy, beautiful complexity of being alive. And I was alive, truly, fully alive, in a way I had not been for years. And I was, at last, at peace. If you have stayed with me until the end, then I thank you for listening to this quiet story of a second chance. And I hope, if you enjoyed it, you might leave a like or a comment, or stay for more stories like this one.